Hi, my name is Elaine Holden. Thank you for joining me today here in Nashua, New Hampshire on Channel 96, Education Matters. I'm delighted to be with you. Last week, I was talking about alphabet, and I got some really good feedback. So thank you all very much for saying you like that show. I started out by explaining that we learn by stories. And one of the important things that we have learned in research in education, especially in the area of reading and writing, is that children need a visual representation of the sounds we work so hard to help them learn. We have 45 sounds called phonemes in the English language. We have 26 letters, and those letters many times carry different sounds. For example, the vowels. A says A says A says A says aw, A says ah. Yeah, all of those different sounds just for one letter. And so you can understand that sometimes it's confusing, which is why, as I've been saying on this show repeatedly, structured literacy is very important. Children need to be taught letter by letter, sound by sound, in a very structured way. But we've also been looking recently in research at something called orthography. The orthographic memory, the visual memory of those little scribbles on the page, those letters. And many children have difficulty sorting out one letter from another. And this is not that unusual. It's not just with the dyslexic population. It's with a good percentage of children. And this is one of the foundation skills that they absolutely have to have. They have to be able to recognize those letters, and they have to be able to language label the letters. The name of the letter never changes. I may say A like in cake. I may say A like in cat. I may say ah like in father. I may say aw like in walk and wasp and wall and water. I can say a lot of different sounds. A table, a chair, the schwa, a. I can say all those sounds, but the letter name never changes. And that's one of the things that we have neglected when we're teaching children many times. I'm not saying phonology isn't important. It is essential, absolutely essential. And we know from research that this is one of the areas that's usually missing in early childhood education, going all the way to grade 3. However, we still have to be able to language label those letters. And as I said, many children have difficulty with this. So last week I started talking about the letters and how they got to be the letters that we use. And this has been over a period of a couple thousand years. We started back in the Fertile Crescent in what is called the Proto-Sinaitic era, okay? Proto-Sinaitic means in that part of the Sinai, in that very early part of the world where civilization started. And it started with those little cuneiform tablets and those little wedges, and they started making, with little letters, little styluses, little shapes, okay? And those little shapes eventually came to represent the sounds of their language. We talked about the Aleph that became A. Aleph, Alpha, A. Beth, Beta, B. Alpha, Beta, Alphabet. C, which started out as a gimel, by the way, and then became a gamel, and then finally camel, because the Etruscan Romans couldn't say g, they could only say k, which is the same sound, except that one is voiced and one isn't. We went to Deleth, delta, d. By the way, the C is the third letter of our alphabet. Gamma is the third letter of the Greek alphabet because the Greeks could say g. So Gimel, g-amel, k-amel, right? K came from g. Same sound, scraping the throat with the tongue. And then we, of course, finished up with the letter E, heh, which was a prayer. So where are we now? Well, the next letter would be the letter F. And I'm going to say the early sound of the letter F, vav. Now you're sitting there saying, wait a minute, stop. Where did we get the f sound from vav? What are you talking about? Well, believe it or not, there is a connection. The first thing we have to remember is that, and I've got some pictures, I don't know if you can see them or not, but they're fish hooks. Yeah, I got fish hooks here. That fish hook has a little mark down and down like that, typical fish hook, right? That's a vav. So I want you to think of saying v. Just say it, v. Put your hand on your voice box and say v. You got anything going on down there? There should be a little bit of a rumble. It's a voiced sound. We call them fricatives. We're not going to use fricatives when we're discussing it with children. You know, you get to be a fourth grade boy and you hear something like that and control is lost. So we try to figure out what is said, what's going on in the mouth with the teeth, the tongue, and the lips, because it is a consonant sound, and the teeth, tongue, and lips are generally involved in consonant sounds. So we feel what's happening. Well, my teeth kind of hook over my bottom lip, and I say, v, okay? And it's rumbled down in my throat, v. Now try saying it without rumbling. Make that same cool air come over your lips, but don't rumble it. What do you get? Yeah, the f sound. So by itself, v and f are identical, except the v is voiced and the f is not voiced. And of course, you know, those Greeks were able to say f and v. The Romans could not. So the best they could do, once again, was the f sound. So here I have my fish hook. Okay? I've got my fish hook. And now I turn my fish hook kind of on the side. And then eventually, what do I have? I have those two hooks of the fish for the fish hook on this side. And that's how the F got to be an F, and saying f. It got there from the v that those Greeks had, and the folks in the Fertile Crescent. So that gives us an F. F. Cool. What's next? Well, we have the letter I. Believe it or not, this is interesting. G does come along, and I'll get to it. Probably not this week, but G does show up. What's interesting is that I, J, and Y all seem to be the same. Nobody paid much attention to the I, the J, and the Y being different. So all you basically had was just this line up and down. Now it started, and I bet you can't see that, so I'm going to draw it right here. Okay? That actually came from Egypt, Egyptian hieroglyphics. I have my little Egyptian scribe here with me again today. So the Egyptian hieroglyphics, believe it or not, started out with an arm and a hand, and that arm and hand was the letter I. It had the I sound. And this letter I became just one line. Just one line, that was it, zoom. And I have my little I right here. So this I also stood for the letter J, J sound, and the letter Y when the Y takes a vowel sound. So you could spell it with an I, a J, or a Y. We still have the Y taking the vowel sounds in English, by the way. When we have the Y in the initial position, like yes and yellow and yell, it's a consonant. In the medial position and in the final position, as I said last week, the Y takes the vowel sound. We don't even end English words in I. If we have an E at the end, like happy, we use a Y, right? If we have sky, we use a Y. And now you're saying ski. Hold on, Elaine. We have the letter I at the end of a word. Well, yes, we do, but it's not English-based. We took it from Norwegian. Norwegian has SKI for that action of sliding down a hill on slippery sticks in the middle of winter. And so we used that SKI, carried it directly over into English. But other than that, we don't end our English-based words in the letter I. Another thing with the Norwegian, the SK is pronounced sh. Yeah, so if you she down a hill, that's basically what you're doing in Norway and not skiing. But we read the SK before we heard it, and so we naturally translated it into our language as sk, as in ski. And that's sometimes what happens. People read it before they hear it, and that changes the sound of the letter. And that happens more often than not, which is why sometimes we look at something and we say, how can you possibly say those letters say that sound or those sounds? It doesn't make sense. Well, it does if you think of people trying to translate one language into another and using their language knowledge of their primary language to do so. So here's my letter I, just plain old I, right? And here's my lowercase I, and here's my cursive I. So after it got as a letter I into the I, the J, and the Y, all kind of blended in together. After it got to Phoenicia, and the Phoenicians started hanging out with the Greeks said, we need a symbol for our I, iota, and so that's how iota got to be this I. And I, as in iota, shows up actually quite a lot in our language. We actually have idiomatic expressions with iota. It's not worth an iota. I'm not going to give it one iota of time. Iota comes directly from the Greek, and iota was used by the Latins as well. But iota means the smallest, because look how little this little guy is in comparison to all of the other letters we've looked at so far. This I is an iota. It's small, it's tiny, it doesn't mean very much. But we also have an anglicized version of iota, jot. Yeah, remember I said I and J and Y kind of all mash in together there? It wasn't until around 1499, maybe 1498, that we saw a differentiation between the I and the J. Before that, you could use an I, you could use a J, whatever you felt like, most likely. But we went from iota to the anglicized version, and it became jot. Do you ever jot a note? Jot, interestingly enough, is that little notation, maybe on a Post-it note or a quick notation that you might send to somebody. I'm going to just jot them a real quick note, let them know that I'm here or that I'm going there or whatever your little jotting is. But jot comes directly from iota. So the J and the I eventually separated. Prior to that, what do we know? Well, I just wrote this out, and I'm left-handed, by the way. So please forgive all of my, you can tell I'm left-handed because I made ink actually mash up all over here. And I have INRI. Have you ever seen that on the top of a Christian cross? Think about it. INRI. It's not on all crosses, but it's certainly on maybe Roman Catholic ones. Well, what does it stand for? It stands for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. INRI. Well, how did that happen? Well, again, that I and the J, if you want to express the initials for Jesus, you wrote the letter I. So here's the letter for Jesus, I, and then N for Nazareth, right? The R is for Rex, because in Latin, king is Rex, okay? That's the Latin word for king. And then I again for Jews, because Jew starts with a J. Again, they chose an I instead of a J, mostly because the I was more familiar to them. So INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And that is why we have the I from 2,000 years ago instead of a regular J that we know. Because, as I said, it didn't separate till 1499, 1498, somewhere in there. I'll take the 1499, but there may be a bit of an argument. In any case, we have Nazareth, we're pretty familiar with that word, and Rex, king. So now you're thinking to yourself, holy smoke, wait a minute. If this is Rex and king, then how come when we talk about the guys that are in charge of the Roman Empire, we always call them Caesar, like Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, and Caesar keeps showing up. It's not a guy's name, it's a title. What happened to Rex? How come we don't have Julius Rex? Well, if we're talking to somebody and we're 2,000 years ago, and we start talking about the king, we would say Rex. We would incorporate the word Rex into the language if we're talking about the king. But long about that time, there was a very rich, very politically well-connected family called the Caesar family. And this Caesar family got to be pretty high up in politics. Well, how high up? Well, they got to be the emperor. And once they became the emperor, they just carried their name with them. And so the name Caesar then became essentially the title. It got taken from the name of the family. And so the name of the family now superseded the word Rex, king. If you're talking about king, who eventually became the emperor, it would depend on the era, but it would start with Rex and then it would slowly progress into Caesar. So that's where we get Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus and all the other Caesars out there. And so you're thinking, well, okay, so the Roman Empire eventually got invaded and fell apart and things went all different places and we never have heard Caesar again. Well, actually, that's not true. Because let's think of how else we talk about our rulers. Go back 100 years. Now remember, this is 2,000 years ago, around that we have Caesar, right? Julius Caesar. And now we're moving ahead a couple thousand years. And who do we have in Germany? We have Kaiser Wilhelm. Remember I said that sometimes you read it before you hear it? Well, Caesar is the S sound because the Romans could not say the G sound. And the S sound was all they could make for the letter C, okay? Which is why the Greeks have Gimel and we have the K, camel, all right? And the S sound comes with it because now the C is a challenge, okay, for some people, and a more guttural Germanic pronunciation would be K, Kaiser. And so Kaiser became another word for king, okay, in Germany, in that Germanic area of Europe. So we go from Caesar to Kaiser, and then king, right? But wait, there's more. Let's think about the Tsar. Yeah, the Tsar of Russia. The Russian word of emperor, king, ruler, Tsar, also comes from Caesar. So that 2,000-year lineage is still in effect. It's still there. It's still moving. It's interesting how the pronunciation changes, how people try to sort of blend in their own language. And that's really how these changes happen, because you're reading ski from Norwegian. And so instead of saying she, you read it and you automatically say ski. Well, same thing with Caesar going into Kaiser and into Tsar. Interesting how this happens. It's also fun, right? So that was my letter I, which I thought was very cool. And now let me flip this up here. I have another letter. Look at that. It kind of looks like a ladder on its side, doesn't it? But it might be a fence. Now remember, our first letter of our alphabet is LF, which is an oxen. So what do you need to hold in the oxen? Well, you need to have a fence. And so we have that fence right here. And that fence is the letter H. Yeah, the letter H. And this is a symbol for fence. It's probably designed to keep our oxen, from wandering off, because that was the way you recorded your wealth, right? So the Greek alphabet took this, and the simple form of H was actually this box. And then it became this line with only 2 marks here, and the other line for the box got removed, and eventually it kind of was a box on an angle. But the whole thing, the letter H, came from this fence on its side. So we have that fascinating, again, sort of history of how the H came to be. And the Semitic cheth and the Greek eta are both linked as far as the label for the letter H goes. And so you can really see a similarity if you turn this on its side, take away a couple of the pieces of the fence, and you've got that fence left over. And so the letter H now is sitting there as the original fence to hold in the Aleph, probably next to the Beth, as they kind of open their Deleth and look out into the field to see what's happening with the cattle. And so they're everyday words. They're words that everybody understood, that they spoke very comfortably, that they used in conversation, and they also were able to take the initial sound from those words, hold that sound in isolation, and then use it to write so that it represented something very tangible. And this is where we really have to be looking at English orthography. We have to be able to teach our children something very visual, very, very tangible. So a fence, how much more tangible could that be, right? We all have seen fences. Cattle, the Aleph, Beth, a house. If they can see the shape representing something that they recognize, they understand the story behind it, then they can turn around and they can start making those linkages with the sounds that they remember and that they can manipulate and hold into what we call short-term auditory sequential memory. So in other words, they hold it for a small amount of time, long enough to decode a word. And they do that because they're looking at the letter, they recognize the letter in isolation. They associate the letter with a sound. They've determined the sound of the letter based upon its accompanying letters around it, and then they can decode. And this sounds very convoluted, but that's actually how people read. We think we read in one great big swoop, but we don't. We read letter by letter by letter. It's just that we do it so fast because as adults we've had so much practice that it seems so seamless and so easy that we don't even have to think about it. But that process to get to that nice super highway of reading takes a long time for many people. And that's why it's so important to have a story, to teach with a story. You feel like Scheherazade. But, and of course, you know, the 1001 Nights, that lovely story or series of stories, and the whole story behind Scheherazade and keeping the king's attention. But just think about this. This is how we learn. This is how we get captivated. If somebody asks you to memorize a series of dates or a series of words that have no meaning or no linkage, it's not going to stick that long in your head. But it will if those words can link to each other and then they can link to a story. And that's really what we try to do with every single letter, so that the child sees the story whenever they see the letter and they link it to the label of that letter. Every time they look at an H or an I or a J, they can name that letter with no difficulty. And once they can name that letter, then they can determine what that letter says. Now, the H is going to say pretty much no matter what, right? The I, however, is going to say a different sound depending upon the letters around it. Is it an open syllable? Is it a closed syllable? Does it come in front of or after another consonant that is going to make it say its different sound? We have all of those decisions to make, but those decisions become extremely automatic once the child has been taught in a very systematic way. Same thing going all the way back to our Egyptians. You can read hieroglyphics only if you look at the determiner, the special symbol at the beginning of the line. It tells you what those sounds are going to be for those symbols. The only difference is, instead of going to the beginning of the line as we would when we're reading hieroglyphics, we actually look within the structure of the syllable. It gets a little more refined in our day and age. Of course, it's taken us 2,000 years for that. But anyway, that is the continuing story of our alphabet. I'm going to be back with more alphabet letters next week, maybe a little bit more etymology. You know, we did the Caesar and the Kaiser and our Tsar this week. We did a few of those words. I'll come up with some more that might be fun. So, in any case, that's my message today. We teach with stories, we teach with pictures, we explain what those little squibbles really mean, and we give them a nice visual representation, something very tangible and easily remembered. And this is what helps children read. I'm glad you joined me today. I thank you very much for your attention and your patience and being here with me. I'll be here again next week. Thank you again.